That's damning. That's really damning.
You did your job. Well done. Next weekend.
It was fine, which sounds really harsh, but
Fine.
it was fine.
Has he just decided to race again?
And the absolute fury in his voice, and you could. So what's going on there? I had to take that mark back because of.
So another year, another slightly uneventful Spanish Grand Prix. But that is not going to stop Alex and I going through and rating all of the drivers. So to kick us off, Alex, I'm going to start straight off with the man who just seemed completely in control of the entire weekend and who is getting a 10 out of 10 for his performance yesterday, and that is Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah, fantastic drive from Lewis. He said that this was right up there with his best race performances. I thought he was sort of alluding to his former teammate Fernando Alonso when he said, "Oh, I'm not like some drivers who call everything what they do their best race, their best performance." But he obviously, as you could sort of tell when he spoke about being in a daze and being that sort of, it's just that sort of perfect form, that perfect clear zone that he was in at the end of the race. He just hit another level that he says he himself rarely finds. It was absolutely brilliant. I did wonder if the fact that he didn't improve on his final lap in Q3, was that going to cost him a 10 because, didn't make a step when he might otherwise have done. But actually, it just showed you that his first lap was as good as it was going to get. Bottas didn't go quicker either. Neither did Verstappen. So I thought that didn't, it'd be really harsh to give him a 9 on the basis of that. So yeah, absolutely faultless, especially in the race. And yeah, 10 out of 10 for Lewis.
It's just another sign that I think that 7th world title is coming slowly. Well, not even slowly. It's definitely on its way, isn't it? It's loading.
Especially when you consider what's happening on the other side of the garage. Like, Bottas is doing so well in qualifying. He really is getting close to him time and time again. But another crucial, it's hard to call it a mistake at the start because it was a tiny little bit of wheel spin as he moved into the second phase that really cost him, but getting pushed down to 4th and then not beating the faster car. Yeah, he said, the delta, the deficit had to be absolutely massive between the tyres if he was going to have any chance of catching Verstappen because the gaps are so small. But that Mercedes is just so brilliant. And it's him again. He started second. He's ended up behind a slower car. He's got to be scored down for that. And he just got bullied at the first corner, really. Lance Stroll had him. He was just like, I'm going to take my chance on Mercedes. And he did. And again, Valtteri, he says he's very honest. It's very nice to hear him say, I can see the championship slipping away again. And he's right. If he's going to put in performances like this are going to keep coming and Hamilton hits these heights again, I don't see how he's going to stop him. Yeah,
it's that consistency, isn't it? So we've given Bottas a 6, which I actually think is maybe slightly harsh. And I'm not one to usually run to Bottas's defence, but I think you're right. It was all in that start, wasn't it? And I thought whilst it was really sad to watch him get swallowed up, I thought his defence around the outside with Perez was pretty tasty. I thought he did well there, and obviously, as you said, we're talking about a record-holding pole sitter that he is his teammate. And he is taking it to him. He's really pushing. Hamilton's having to find that extra pace. It's not an easy time for him on Saturday, but you're right. He can't afford P3s if Lewis is winning all the time. And it's just, so I would maybe give Bottas a 7. Let's move on to Red Bull. And another just absolutely stellar drive from Max Verstappen, who also is getting a 10 out of 10. And I think deserved. He just doesn't seem to put a foot wrong. He's getting absolutely everything out of that Red Bull. He looks challenging to Mercedes, which in 2020 is a big deal. And that Red Bull looked like it had the same race pace as the Mercedes, and he did everything he absolutely could. He capitalised on that start. The only thing I would say is, and I guess this was linked a little bit to what we were talking about last week when the drivers and their engineers are disagreeing about strategy, he was extremely passionate this race. I know we had the joke about him saying he didn't want to be a grandma running around at the back, but he was properly not on board with what Red Bull wanted him to do at the start of that stint, really, was he?
Yeah, I think he was just exasperated at the fact the win was gone by that point, because it's at the end of the first stint. He knew his soft tyres were at the end of their life. Red Bull knew they had to keep him out there because Mercedes had realised their own tyres were performing so well, they could extend the stint. So Verstappen, the earlier he came in, they were effectively losing the race to Lewis Hamilton. And Verstappen knew that. he said it in the press conference. I said, when did you realize the race was lost? It was like in the middle of that first stint. He knew that it wasn't going to be another Silverstone day. And that's where I think that frustration, that sort of that amazing sort of snappiness that both driver and engineer had. I quite like the way he was told, just get your head down. I quite like the fact that the engineer isn't scared of him. Is free to tell him exactly what he needs to do. But yeah, I did think he nevertheless earned a 10 because of the fact he beat Bottas in what is a much faster Mercedes.
So again, on the flip side, his teammate, it's just like, he's just got to work out that Saturday. It's just still not coming. And, again, like he gets his elbows out on race day. He's got really good racecraft. But again, it just didn't seem like a very good Sunday for him again.
No, it was a sort of a weird one from Red Bull actually this time, I thought, in the fact that, he didn't have an extra set of mediums like Verstappen did. So he had to sort of either go onto the hards or take the sort of slightly unusual soft, double soft route, which actually Pirelli was saying before the race that's what some of the teams would have to do. That was the quickest way, although the leaders didn't bother with that. So Red Bull put him onto the hards, but it was the fact they put him out in loads of traffic. It was particularly bizarre. It was like, well, surely you would have seen that was going to happen. You know how good your pit stops are. What was that all about? Were they just doing it as an experiment, to see if Verstappen could use the hards, which is a bit damning if that's the case, but they haven't come out and said that. But again, I sort of had to go back to our rules here, and this was a solid performance from Alex Albon. It wasn't a good performance because he got out qualified by some much slower cars in the racing points in qualifying, and that means that ultimately, you said, just affects his Sunday score again.
Right, let's move on to Racing Point, and actually enter Lance Stroll. He showed up yesterday and had a really strong performance for which he's earning an 8 out of 10. And as you've kind of put, like, fourth's the absolute maximum that we're thinking Racing Point can really achieve. He basically turned up and he did what he had to do, and it was good to see. I think he needed a performance like that.
He certainly did. I mean, I've been pretty critical of him, especially in recent races on, in the Autosport magazine, in the driver ratings, autosport.com+, and of course here on YouTube, Jess. But you're right. He did turn up. He did very, very well. Can't quite earn a 9 because Perez did beat him in qualifying, but I still think he deserves credit for getting so close to Perez, who we know he's sort of a faster overall driver. But I love the start. I love what he did there. He was just like, I've got a great run. He picked up the toe from both Verstappen and Bottas, and was just like, you know what? I know I'm not going to finish third, but I'm going to have a go anyway. I'm going to get ahead of a Mercedes for a few laps. And he absolutely, like I said at the start, bullied Bottas at the first corner. It was brilliant. Did very well in a 2-stopper. We know that, he's never going to be able to do what Perez does with those tyres and make the 1-stopper last. But he was absolutely solid in that. And, he had the pace at the end to overcome Vettel and get back to Perez, Jess, who, gets a 7 because of what happened with the blue flags. It was really weird. Like, his explanation was like, oh, well, Lewis was behind me, but, there was no place to let him by, and he'd have lost time and I'd have lost time. And it was like, I understand what you're saying, Sergio, but the steward said you got blue flags at turn 6, and then he doesn't get by until turn 1 on the next lap. So what were you thinking there? Like, there was a slam dunk penalty, the FIA clamping down on blue flags being ignored, and it just undid his typically fine work to make a 1-stop last and cost him 4th place. So a great return from obviously his coronavirus quarantine, but what was he doing with the blue flags? Like, it's pretty obvious.
Let's move on to McLaren, and again another pretty damn good job from Carlos Sainz. He'd kind of maybe got a little bit lost in that midfield, but he's still got these really strong performances in his back pocket. And so he's gained a 9 out of 10 for a 6th place finish, which was pretty good for him.
Yeah, I thought I really undenied about whether giving him a 10, but I thought he didn't do that sort of little bit extra that the other drivers that get a 10, and as you'll come on to, there is someone else who does, did, in the fact that he didn't sort of overturn something really unexpected. He didn't totally dominate his position. He just did exactly what he had to and was brilliant at it, which I thought is the definition of a 9 there. he was fantastic in qualifying, led the McLarens there. Obviously, he does go very well at what is his home Formula One track. It's interesting, his race was actually mainly with Albon, and he sort of came out behind despite the fact that Albon was put into traffic with the hards. But it was a great overtake he put into him on turn one. Then later on, when he comes out of his second pit stop, he has to defend pretty hard. I think Albon was a little bit annoyed about there's sort of a slight moment of left hand down as he comes through turn four that I think Albon was a bit furious about. But it looked fine. It didn't look like there were particularly close to contact when you consider how far back Albon was. And from there, he just did what he had to. Other drivers may not have got past Vettel, who was putting in such a good performance on the one stopper, but he did, and he maximised his result.
Conversely, Lando Norris, again, another bad start, which he's had before this season already, even though he's had some great performances. That start seems to be a bit of an Achilles heel for him sometimes. I won't maybe say it's a massive issue for him, but he does, especially on a track like this where we know it's difficult, and he did end up basically in a train for most of the race. He was pushing hard, wasn't he? Like, he had a few lockups. You could tell he was really, really trying out there, but just didn't come to him in the end. And I've seen you've put here that he felt his car came alive at the end. What was that about?
Yeah, I think McLaren were a bit surprised with what was going on with the tyres. They were a bit like Mercedes. They were expecting to have a very hard race, so they put in a lot of work to understand what would happen with the tyres. But yeah, you're right, Jess. I mean, yeah, the traffic really did cost him a lot, but that was sort of his own fault, really. It wasn't actually the launch off the line this time, like it has been at some other races this season.
Yeah.
The AlphaTauri does sort of come by on the run to turn one, but it's actually turn three where Leclerc is already alongside, and they have this great run through the corner, and they're both sort of wiggling, and Norris just gets again a bit like Bottas, again sort of a bit bullied, bit pushed out wide, and that puts him on the back foot. As you say, he's in traffic. He does show very well. Again, battling Leclerc later on in the race. But yeah, I thought that what just cost him a 7, because this was 7. This was a good performance, was the fact that everything meant he lost to a slower car in the AlphaTauri and Gasly. And I thought that just the fact, behind science in qualifying, just edged him down from a 7. But it was a solid drive, and I think that's why I felt that 6 was appropriate.
Now, Ferrari, I think you're going to upset a lot of people here, Alex. Because you've given driver of the day, Sebastian Vettel, a 7 out of 10. Which I think a lot of people aren't going to agree with. And if you don't agree, make sure you head on over to Autosport.com, where our driver ratings are on there, and you can actually have a go at rating the drivers yourself and changing the average. We love to see what you guys at home think versus what we think. So make sure you head on over there and get involved. But talk to me about Vettel.
Well, it comes back again to the fact that this is a weekend performance ranking, and he got knocked out in Q2 again. Yeah, the midfield is very, very tight. Leclerc only ends up a couple of spots ahead of him on the grid, but nevertheless, he got through to Q3, and he did what the Ferrari is capable of. Again, I'm using Pierre Gasly as quite a reference for a lot of drivers, because again, this just shows you how good Gasly was. He gets beaten in qualifying by a much slower AlphaTauri, and that's what cost him an 8, because he can't get higher than that, because he made a big mistake there. He didn't get through to qualifying. Don't get me wrong, his drive on Sunday was absolutely fantastic. I think driver of the day sort of diminishes what Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen were doing, but nevertheless, it was brilliant from Vettel.
No one likes giving driver of the day to the lead driver, though, do they? Because it's almost too easy. It's like,
I can understand that.
Who's had a challenge? Who's at the back and deserves a bit of a nod? Now, his teammate Charles Leclerc didn't finish the race, unfortunately, because he had that strange happening where his engine's cut off and he got sent into a spin, and then they got it going again, and he was racing for a couple of laps without a seatbelt on, which I thought was very strange. But he seemed to be okay with it, but obviously the FIA probably weren't very happy with the fact that they did that. He was qualifying well. He qualified ahead of Vettel, and he also, someone pointed out to me, he actually did 29 laps in the first stint, carrying a much heavier fuel load. So, he was on track for a Vettel-like performance. He just didn't get to finish it in the end.
Absolutely, Jess. And for all those reasons, that's why he had to get an 8, because he was the better Ferrari driver. He would have finished ahead, as you say. He thought the one stopper was going to work. It wasn't going to work quite as well as it had in Silverstone. And again, he wasn't quite at the highest plane efforts and levels that we saw, when he gets his 4th place the week before. He wasn't quite as good in qualifying, but then Barcelona's such a different track, and it sort of, it varies things up for the Ferrari. But yeah, I was impressed by Leclerc. I thought that I thought that, like you say, the spin and everything, that was really bizarre. And what was the most strange thing about it was that he's sort of trying to get the engine fired up, realizes he's like, well, I can't do it, so I'll get out. And then it sort of it does work again. And he's like, I'm half out of the car now. I've got to drive this thing back. So yeah, bizarre that. But yeah, didn't think he did a lot wrong really. And for that reason, considering, you know, how good he was and where he ultimately, because he ultimately might even have finished sixth if he'd been able to keep up his pace, which Vettel couldn't do because he started behind. So that's why I felt he deserved the higher mark.
AlphaTauri now, and Mr. Consistency, I think I'm just going to start calling him. Pierre Gasly, he's got another 9 out of 10. And again, it's just, you love to see it really, don't you?
You do, and I love talking about AlphaTauri this season because I think both drivers are doing absolutely magnificently, and it's so great to see a driver that 12 months ago was so down and devastated after his Red Bull demotion. But yeah, Jess, if he'd lived up to his Mr. Consistency billing completely this weekend, he would have earned a 10. But he doesn't, because if he basically couldn't reproduce his Q2 form in Q3. Now we saw this quite a lot with the Mercedes drivers and Verstappen at the head of the field, but the fact is they still went faster in the final segment, so they didn't miss out really by they already hit what they were capable of on the first runs. Whereas Gasly, if he'd been able to reproduce his Q3 time, he actually would have started sixth and ahead of a lot of cars with a stunning qualifying performance. Still brilliant to get into Q3 in AlphaTauri, don't get me wrong. But yeah, that's why he just didn't quite earn a 10 because he didn't maximise his overall weekend result. But he was great in the race. Again, was another driver that was stuck in the traffic and the DRS and the cars being so close together meant they couldn't really go forwards. But also that meant that he never really looked like he wasn't going to finish in the points. And he finished just half a second back from Albon in the Red Bull, which started ahead at the end of the race.
Teammate Daniel Kvyat, as you've pointed out, Alex, like he only finished where he started because of Leclerc's DNF. But again, like it looked like a good race for him, and then he got the penalty, which obviously dropped him with 5 seconds on top. And he had a strange kind of coming together with Magnussen, but you've said that wasn't his fault.
No, so that was at the very start of qualifying. He sort of impeded Magnussen as Magnussen was on a flying lap, but fortunately for Kvyat, the team hadn't warned him, and basically the stewards saw that as soon as he saw the Haas coming, he was, oh my God, I've got to get out of the way. And he does that, and that's why he doesn't get a penalty. But yeah, so lucky on that part, because that would have impacted his score had the team warned him. But when we think about his race, I thought that this was close to an 8. It was very close to an 8. He didn't sort of go anywhere, but then there wasn't really much where he could go, considering he was on a 2-stopper in that part of the rate. That part of the field, the 1-stopper was the one to be on, which is why Ricciardo gets ahead of him. And yeah, he just sort of he did good. He did close to an 8. But yeah, again, it's like with Perez. I felt I had to take that mark back because of the ignoring blue flags. It's the same problem. Slam dunk. The FIA had him, and there we go. That's why he isn't quite as high up as his teammate.
Maybe this is another reason why we need those 0.5, but we don't allow that over here at Autosport. We need rounded numbers. Renault, I'm going to start with Esteban Ocon, because again, I think a lot of people are going to be quite shocked that you've given him a 5 out of 10. Now, it definitely wasn't a great weekend for him. Another Magnussen incident, but the FP3 crash was very strange. I mean, what was going on there?
Yeah, I mean, did those people see Esteban Ocon crash sort of behind another car because he was looking in his mirrors? Like, this is the thing. The steward said neither of them was at fault, but yeah, it was Ocon. Like, Magnussen moves out of the way of the Williams that's actually on a flying lap. And I saw some frankly idiots on Twitter being like, "Oh, we brake tested him." Well, we didn't. His car was ERS harvesting. It's like, come on, let's wait to see what the actual judgment is before you condemn someone. And yeah, but Ocon did the same thing. He said he was looking at Latifi. He didn't seem to consider the fact that Magnussen might be ahead of him. Then he's like, "Oh, into the wall, sloppy." Anyway, that's one thing. Then he gets beaten by an Alfa Romeo in qualifying. Like,
yeah.
That's damning. That's really damning. It's one of the slowest cars on the grid. Back at Silverstone, they were right at the back in qualifying. So what's going on there, Esteban? He comes home 13th, which, as we said with Kvyat, is only because Leclerc retires in front of him. Like, he showed well. He showed okay. We showed what we expect of him, but he didn't do anything. He didn't do anything with it. So I thought that, yeah, I couldn't really score him higher. It was patchy. It was the definition of our rules.
And I guess conversely, Ricciardo basically got what he could have done. It, well, again, not like magic, but did a decent one-stopper, came home 11th. Out of the points, unfortunately, for Renault, considering they were coming off quite a high from Silverstone. But yeah, just kind of a 7, kind of an all right. You did your job, well done. Next weekend.
Exactly that, Jess. Exactly that. But the reason why he doesn't quite go where Sainz goes is because he missed Q3, was beaten by Gasly's slower car in both qualifying and the race. And I just thought that couldn't. Yeah, like you say, he was there or thereabouts where that Renault should have been, but just wasn't anything more. Great drive in the one stop still, good for that. But just the overall, the fact that he finishes behind the slower car in the AlphaTauri, doesn't really work. And also he felt that he just lost a little bit of time, whether that was in his own pace or maybe those pesky blue flags coming into play again, as he obviously obeyed them because he didn't get a penalty, because he was tracking Vettel basically at the start of the race on the same strategy, and Vettel pulled it off magnificently, whereas Ricciardo it was fine. Which sounds really harsh, but
fine.
That's what it was. It was fine.
I think that's a good summary of his race. Fine. Yeah. All right. Now, someone who just pulled it out of nowhere, seemingly, is Kimi Räikkönen in the Alfa Romeo. I mean, has he just decided to race again? Like, I feel it felt like it was just a different Kimi Räikkönen.
Oh, it really did. I mean, I love thinking back to that radio message in the British Grand Prix where he's called in the last minute, and the absolute fury in his voice. And there was actually another moment later on in the pit stop in that race where Alfa Romeo were like, "Oh, we might retire," and he's like, "What do you mean?" What? And him and his engineer just confuse each other. It's brilliant, but it just sort of summed up what was going on this season. It was sort of just so nothingy because the Ferrari engine deficit, it's really harming the potential of the Alfa Romeo. Obviously, the package isn't the strongest on the grid. It's going to be, in the lower midfield fight. But yeah, it hadn't come alive for Raikkonen until qualifying on Saturday. Like Romain Grosjean was stealing all the headlines with his practice pace, which I think was probably because he didn't have any fuel in his car. That's what he said. The thing with Raikkonen was that he just switched it on. It was him. It wasn't George Russell this time. He got into Q2. First time that car's been able to do that this season, and he did it because his teammate didn't. His teammate qualified last again.
Yeah.
The Alfa was at the back again. So fantastic for Raikkonen. That's why he got a 10, because he backed that up in the race by absolutely finishing where that car was only capable of finishing.
Giovinazzi, on the other hand, or Giovinazzi, everyone's going to go mad at me in the comments now. Giovinazzi, on the other hand, didn't. So he's got a 6 out of 10 for all those reasons you just said. Qualified well below, not just well below his teammate, but dead last. It wasn't a terrible weekend, but I guess in comparison to your teammate who's just had a stellar weekend, it's quite hard to give him anything higher than a 6, really, isn't it?
Yeah, again, it was solid, and he lost what might have been a 7 by the fact his qualifying performance was so bad compared to his teammate. He had a lot of work to do in the race. He did show good pace, beats Russell, who was also very impressive in the race, but it just wasn't enough to overcome Magnussen on the one stopper. And maybe that might even have, cost him relative to Grosjean too, as we'll come on to discuss. Grosjean did not help himself in the end. I just didn't think he could score higher than a 6 this time.
Well, let's move on to Haas then, as you linked that so nicely. And let's talk about Romain Grosjean, who has the lowest score on the doors this week with a 4 out of 10. Quite damning, that. Explain why it's a 4.
Because there were so many reasons why Grosjean deserved to be marked down. Beaten by his teammate in qualifying. Again, they were. It was really hard to get out of Q1, as it will be all season for Haas. And then neither of them did it this time, but Magnussen finished ahead, which was like, it was so weird because Grosjean had stunned everyone in practice by being 5th and 6th. As I said, I think there was a reason for that. But it was just like, well, hang on a minute, where's all your pace gone? What's happened? How's this not? You're not progressing through the weekend as you need to get a good result here. But then there's 3 moments at the end of the race that just brought his score tumbling down, because he was on a one stopper. It was working out fine for Haas. Magnussen made it work, relative to the opposition. But there was the defence against Raikkonen, which, like I said, not as bad as what I thought it was on first glance, but it was still pretty naughty, and Kimi can rightly be furious with what happened. Then there was the clash with Giovinazzi at turn 1, which the stewards investigated and basically said that Giovinazzi was so far alongside, he'd earned the right to some space, and Grosjean just kept coming across on him. What was he doing there? And the point with this is that he goes off the track and damages his own car. Yeah. He hits a curb, it flies, a bit flies off, and Lewis Hamilton runs over it. Now, if Lewis Hamilton had lost the race because of Grosjean's defending there, that's not really on, is it? I mean, he harmed himself ultimately and nobody else, but still not good from Grosjean. But then actually the worst thing was the half spin at the turn sort of 7 and 8, that far sort of complex in the middle sector. It means he has to take a second stop, and that's why he finishes last. And that whole combination, but particularly the last thing, yeah, it was disappointing. It was poor. It was a 4.
Bad times for Grosjean. Right, let's move on to Williams now. And so George Russell's got a 7 out of 10. He couldn't quite get the Williams out of Q1, which was a bit of a shame because he has had such great Saturdays, being Mr. Saturday himself. But again, just seemed to have a pretty all right time of it. Nothing really to write home about, but still pretty decent in the end.
Yeah, exactly that, Jess. I mean, there's no qualifying heroics to bump up his score, as has happened on so many occasions so far this season. But he was actually really pleased with how his race went. I think, I think you can be quite proud of it. He really took it to the opposition, where you think about last year, Williams was so far off the back. Like, it must be such a good new learning and exciting experience for Russell going up against these cars. As I said, that battle with Grosjean on the first lap, and then, just generally he had some good overtakes with Raikkonen and everybody else at the back. But it was a 2-stopper. Williams didn't think he could do a 1-stopper. I think we saw that in Silverstone. The car just chews for his tyres that little bit too much, which is what's going to happen, when you've not got the package that or they do have the package that they've got at the back. So yeah, it was good. It was good. This was pretty solid for George Russell. And then his teammate Nicholas Latifi, again, it just wasn't like Silverstone was great. I thought it was brilliant at 70th anniversary Grand Prix, but he was solid, and that's why I thought initially a 6. And his race was just undone from the start. He was really timid at the first corner after a good launch, and then the pack just gets away from him. And he just said he had no confidence in the first stint, and that was why his race didn't go anywhere really.
So that's the drivers rated for the Spanish Grand Prix. What do you think at home? Do you agree with our ratings? Do you disagree with our ratings? If you do disagree, make sure you let us know in the comments. We hold our breath as we go through them. But also head on over to Autosport.com, where you can rate the drivers yourself and give us a different average score. But make sure you tune in next time. We'll be rating the drivers after the Belgian Grand Prix in a couple of weeks' time. And until then, we'll see you then.